Hey, welcome. Okay, so our topic this evening is, or this afternoon, is intertidal invertebrates, and specifically talking about the outer coast. So the beach environment on the outer coast is a hostile one, yet it is home to a wide diversity of wildlife who live their entire lives in that fluctuating space between the sea and the shore. And we're going to be visiting Ecola State Park later this month, and so that's in Oregon. And so I wanted to introduce you to some of the creatures you might see in the intertidal zone. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to 3 of the intertidal zones, give you a quick overview of the type of organisms who live there. We'll sketch a representative from each zone, and then I'll do a quick overview of beach etiquette. And we're going to be making a total of 4 sketches today. So there's 5 intertidal zones on the beach, which are easy to distinguish on rocky shorelines, like some of the ones we have in Oregon. Here we can see 3 of them. There's the high tide zone, which is home to such animals as acorn barnacles, limpets, and periwinkles. In the middle tide zone, which has the mussels and larger acorn barnacles. You'll also see the gooseneck barnacles in this area, and sometimes sea stars and whelks and chitons. And then the low tide zone is home to the giant green anemones, nudibranchs, sea cucumbers, and other more delicate varieties of sea stars like the blood star, brittle stars, and such. The other 2 zones that aren't in this picture are the spray zone, which is above the high tide zone, and that's where ocean waves will splash, and it might become inundated during the king tides, but it's generally not underwater ever. And then the subtidal zone, which is always underwater except for those extreme low tides. The tide's only going to be going down to a negative 0.2 on our field trip. So we're mostly going to be seeing creatures in the mid-intertidal zone. But sometimes there's tide pools, which mimic the lower tide zones, like in this picture here. So we're looking at kind of an upper middle tide zone in the photo. And then in that little tide pool, you're actually getting low tide zone creatures because that water is always there. So they're able to survive in that space. But let's see. Yeah, okay, yeah. So we're gonna start looking at some creatures from the different zones. So we're gonna start with the high tide zone. This is the realm of organisms that are capable of withstanding long exposures to air, direct sunlight, and high salt content, as well as pounding surf. It's only covered by seawater during the high tide. And so you're looking at, in this picture, you see some of the lichens from the splash zone are in this area, but you're also getting some of the algae from the mid-tide zone. You're also going to see lots of acorn barnacles, which are the small barnacles that make large, dense coverings over the rock. Lichens, which are these shield-shaped shells here, and then periwinkles, which are the little tiny snails. There's also isopods that will crawl around this area, and those are basically, they're like pill bugs. They're related to pill bugs. They're in the crustacean subphylum. They're actually like related to barnacles in a way. And then the limpets and the periwinkles are in the gastropod class. And so this is going to be our first sketch. And I have 5 minutes for each sketching session. So hopefully that's not too much for you. But so gastropod, these are gastropods, and gastropod means stomach foot. And it refers to all the creatures that crawl around on their bellies. So on land, you're going to know these as the slugs and snails. And in the intertidal zone, they show up as periwinkles, which are the creatures on the screen right now, limpets, whelks, chitons, and nudibranchs. So this is a pair of periwinkles. And what are some things that you notice about these animals? So I see that they have a spiral shaped shell, and yeah, I love their spiral shells too. And I see little black things sticking out the right side, which are, I call them the antenna. And now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if they have a different name. They are different colors, but the same animal. And this variety, these are from the northwest coast of Washington. And I don't know if there's different periwinkles in different regions of the Pacific coast. So that's a question I'll have to look at later. But my understanding is these two are in the same species. They just have some variation in the color of their shell, kind of like manila clams. I don't know if you have manila clams in California, but um, there's a lot of variation in the color of the manila clam shell or the pattern of the colors. So let's see, something else I notice is I can see something here. I mean, I know what I'm looking at, but I'm trying not to use previous knowledge, but I think I see the body of the animal here at the base of the darker shell. So I'm going to go ahead and try and sketch these. Maybe I'll just do 3 minutes since it's just the two of us today. I'll put my timer on. Okay. I'm gonna, yeah, and I don't remember seeing so there's a comment in the chat about not seeing the heads like you would on land snails. I'm trying to remember when I've looked at these creatures before. I think I have seen a little bit of the head, but not at all like on a land snail where you have a large part of the body coming out of the shell, head of the shell. Let me mute myself while I draw. Something else I notice is there appear to be growth rings on these creatures. You can see these parallel lines that are kind of perpendicular to the curve of the shell. I also noticed that the outer or the older whorls look like they are worn a bit, almost like a statue that's been in the rain, like what acid rain can do to some statues, giving them that weathered or that eroded look. Okay, let's see. Our next creature or our next zone is the middle tide zone. And this is the area that it has less exposure to air and direct sunlight, as it's only compared to the high tide zone, it's only exposed during low tides. And like organisms in the high tide zone, these animals have to be adapted to exposure to air and sunlight, but they aren't they aren't exposed as long. They're also subject to the effect of storm waves, including the occasional log strike. So sometimes when you're in this area of the intertidal, you'll see large sections of rock that have just been smashed clean of all life from logs that are battering against them in the winter storms. The organisms that you're likely to find here are blue mussels, larger acorn barnacles, the gooseneck barnacles, chitons, aggregate anemones. That's what's in this lower right picture here. Whelks and sea stars. And so the whelks are basically a marine snail, and the gooseneck barnacles they're an interesting looking creature. I should have put a close up in here, but they have a long flexible stalk with a kind of the end of them kind of looks like a pistachio shell, and that's got some of that armor that you might be used to seeing on the barnacles. But that long stalk is just fleshy and tender, and so they grow in these huge clumps, and that kind of helps to protect the fleshy part. So these critters, yeah, I already said they're exposed less of the time than the high tide zone, but they do get exposed twice a day. So the creature that we're going to sketch for this section is a sea star, and this is one of many animals that's capable of moving up and down in the tide zone, but they like to hang out in this area because they eat hard-shelled organisms like mussels. And you can see that this animal here is taking a break. It's low tide right now, but it's right on the edge of that. It's right on the edge of the middle and low tide zone, ready to go back up when the tide comes in and find its next meal. So sea stars are an echinoderm, which means spiny skin. And the echinoderms include all of the various kinds of sea stars, as well as sea urchins, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, and crinoids, which are also known as sea lilies. They don't always have a tough skin like this ochre star, but they do have radial symmetry, and they tend to be their body parts tend to be in groups of 5. So these, as I mentioned, the ochre stars are voracious hunters, and they will consume any of the hard-shell animals they can get a hold of. And yeah, so what are some of the details that you notice about this animal, about the sea star in this picture? I notice it has a lot of white spots on it. And I know from having handled these animals that those are raised portions on its skin. Yeah, it's a pretty pink red color. And they come in, they can be purple or orange or a maroon color. So this species comes in a variety of colors. I can see that there's a little spot here that's orange. It's interesting. As I'm noticing things on the animal, I'm remembering how many things I've forgotten. I used to be a park ranger, and for the last 7 years or so, I have not been working in the field, and I'm amazed at how much of my naturalist knowledge is gone, and I don't realize it's gone until I'm looking for it, and I can't remember what that spot does, what it's for. I think it has something to do with its it's not the vascular system, but the water system in its body. is it uses water in its little tube feet to hold on to rocks. So it's got all these little straw-like feet on the underside of it with suction cups at the end that hold on to the rock, and it sucks the water out of them, kind of like when you suck on a straw to make that vacuum, and that's what holds it in place. I think that spot has to do with that system, but I don't remember. I'm gonna have to look it up. I also noticed that it has 5 legs, and there's almost, and I don't know if this is just my imagination or not, but it almost looks like the white dots on the center of it kind of correlate to these 5 legs. And there's almost like a vein of white dots running down the center of each leg. I've seen sea otters eating sea stars in Alaska, and they bring them to the surface and then they eat the legs down so that there's only this central disc left. And apparently the sea stars are able to regrow their legs and survive that massive loss. It blows my mind. Okay, so let's, I'm gonna mute myself and I'm gonna finish talking first. I'm gonna mute myself and we're gonna take 3 minutes to sketch this animal. Oh, there's one more comment here. Oh, wow, yeah, it's pretty amazing. As I'm starting, yay, we have someone joined us. Welcome. We are sketching the sea star in this image. I can't see, let's see, here we go. Hi, Heather, yay, welcome. We're sketching right now. And so another thing I've noticed as I'm starting to sketch is that this animal has kind of molded its body to fit in around the creatures are already on. This kind of neat. Okay, on to our next. So we are now looking at the low tide zone. So this is the area that is usually underwater. And yeah, so there's a lot less impact on this area compared to the upper and the middle tide zones. The animals are usually underwater. There's fewer changes in temperature. There's less exposure to air, and there's less exposure to crashing waves. The critters here are capable of surviving exposure to air and heat, but they lack those protective structures that you see. A lot of the creatures down here lack the protective structures you see in the upper and middle tide zone. Um, yeah, so they're not able to be out of the water as long. That's why you don't see these organisms up higher unless they're in a tide pool where there's water, even during low tide. So the diversity of life in this region is usually higher, at least when the tide's in. And it includes animals such as these giant green anemones, hermit crabs. There's actually a Dungeness crab under the sand here. You can see his claw sticking out, and the front of his carapace, his little eyes and his little mouth parts are sticking out here. You'll also find nudibranchs, fish, if there's water, and some of the creatures for the higher tide zones. So you can see whelks and then some mussels. You can see there's a whelk here and some mussels here on the underside of this rock. Also I think that's an aggregating anemone, which you usually see a little bit higher up. Yeah, so this is a fun. Oh, and if there's sea urchins in the area, this is the area where you're going to see sea urchins. They're not going to be higher up. So the animal for this section that we're going to focus on is the giant green anemone. They're one of the most stunning, obvious creatures in this zone. They're in the Cnidarian phylum, which is a large group of animals that they all share the characteristic of having stinging cells in their skin that they can use, or in their surface parts that they can use to capture prey. So the term Cnidarian actually means stinging nettle in Greek. Other animals in this group are jellyfish and corals. And though they seem sessile, like they can't move, they're actually able to move around a bit in their environment on their petal disc. So like on the base of their column, though very slowly. One of my favorite attributes about this animal is that they actually have the ability to reproduce by tearing themselves into two pieces. Blows my mind, but they can just two sides of themselves pull away in opposite directions, and then they split into two creatures over a long period of time. It's not instantaneous. Another fun attribute is that anemones have a symbiotic relationship with a couple of different kinds of algae that live in the anemone's gastrodermal cells. So an anemone, tripping over the word now, an anemone is like a bag with a little tiny opening in the top, and inside you have the outer skin wall, which is what we see, and then they have an inner skin wall, which is the gastrodermal cells. And so some of that green, yeah, it's kind of like you said grand scale cell division. Yes, I've always thought about what I learned about amoebas when I was a kid, about how they split down that center of the nucleus into two animals. Yeah. So let's see, we're going to first notice some things about this. So what are some characteristics or features or anything that you notice about the giant green anemones in this photo?
There is an out and an in position.
Good observation. Like that. In, out, half and half. So interesting that they have the smooth center between all the tentacles. Yeah, that's a good observation. I haven't paid attention to that before. The rest of the skin is lumpy, and on the column is lumpy, but that center part's smooth. I wonder if that helps if that makes it more difficult for their prey to escape. There's nothing to grab onto. I notice there's lots and lots of tentacles. And then there's this little sphincter. There's this little hole here. Looks like a sphincter in the center. And this one seems to have some debris in it. I also see this one. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I believe in not, of course, in Oregon where we are, because we're not a tropical area, but in tropical places, anemones also have symbiotic relationships with like clownfish.
Okay.
Is my understanding, because you'll often see a clownfish sort of like hiding in the tentacles or whatever.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that from some, yes, I remember hearing that as well. I think I've even seen it in an aquarium, but I don't remember what the relationship is. Very cool. All right, we're going to take a few minutes. I'm going to give us the whole, we've been doing 3 minutes. I'm going to give us 5 for this creature because it's a little more complex. So I'm going to mute myself and we're going to sketch. All right, we're going to go on to the next slide now. So this is our final critter before we wrap up. So I wanted to share one more, and it's the short crab. I have a particular fondness for short crabs. There's so many different species, and they can be found in the middle and high tide zones. Excuse me, the middle and the lower tide zones. This critter is a Hemigraspis nudus, or purple short crab. It's one of the more common ones along our coastline. They're often found under rocks during low tides, so you want to be careful when you're exploring that. When you don't want to step on rocks that toggle, because there'll be critters underneath that can get squashed. You can tell the difference between the male and the female crabs by the shape of their abdominal plate, or the apron. In this top image, this is a female pebble crab, and she's actually full of eggs right now. But the female crabs have a broad apron that goes across the whole abdomen. It's round, more like a shape of a coin, and that's designed to be able to hold those eggs. Whereas the males, such as this pebble crab at the bottom, they have a very narrow apron, because it's not, they're not storing anything in there. So they don't need the broad space. So if this was a female in the bottom, the apron would be twice as wide as what you're seeing in the male. So yeah, so looking at this image, what are some things that you notice about this animal?
The legs are the front legs are different than the rear sets of legs, and the front legs are spotted.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to see, but it's got little eye stalks here. I noticed that the carapace is mostly smooth. There's a little indentation here, and a little one here, and a little one here. So there's 3 little kind of notches on each side of the eye. They have 8. Oh, go ahead.
Are you using your pointer? If so, I'm not seeing it.
Oh, it's not showing up.
Uh-uh.
I don't know how to. That's weird. Okay, well, that's good to know. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, so if you look at the main body part, there are yeah, well, gosh darn it. Laser pointer. Here we go. Okay, do you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, so here's the one eye stalk, and here's the other. And then just to the side of the eye stalk on this side, you can see the first notch is here, the second notch is there, and the third notch is there. And so they have those 3 notches on each side. In larger crabs, there's one of the distinguishing characteristics from one crab species to another is the number and the shape of those the edges of the carapace. And so it's a fun thing to look at when you're identifying your crabs. And then also they have 8 regular legs with just these little pokey tips at the end, and then they have 2 grabber legs. And so I think of them as 8 walking legs and 2 feeding legs, and the feeding legs have the claws on them. All right, how do I turn the laser pointer off? There we go. Okay. All right, well, let's take some time. Let's take a few minutes and sketch this critter. As I'm sketching, I'm noticing that the legs are jointed like an insect. Hmm. I'm finish up your sketch. Move on to the next slide. So there are a variety of organisms who live in the sandy and rocky substrates where we will be visiting. While they're adapted to withstanding the beating waves and the drying air, they're fragile in the face of our curiosity. So our experience is going to be enriched by their presence. So I want to share a few tips so that we can help return the favor by being careful with our bodies and our behavior as we're exploring their home. Some of the ways that we can help keep these organisms from harm are to walk slowly and watch where we place our feet. Avoid stepping on creatures whose shells or bodies would be crushed under our weight. And also, like I mentioned earlier, be careful of stepping on rocks that aren't steady, that might shift when you step on them and crush whoever's underneath. I try not to pick up anybody who isn't easily lifted. Sea stars in particular can suffer debilitating harm if they're removed from rocks. Their tube feet, which hold on via suction, will actually can be torn off if they're pried off the rocks and then are non-functional and they're not able to hold on because the suction cup parts have been torn and then they can't survive because they're just buffeted around in the surf and then get washed ashore. Okay, so sorry about that. If you're going to move a rock, only move rocks that you can actually lift completely off the ground. Rocks that require being toggled or tilted end up crushing organisms that are underneath the lower end side. And then always place rocks back in the orientation that you found them, being careful not to crush anybody that's underneath. And then lastly, don't remove anyone who's alive. And then leave snail shells for the hermit crabs. Oftentimes, well, I don't know about often, but I have made the mistake of bringing what I thought was an empty shell home, only to discover there was somebody in it, because the hermit crabs are able to go back farther in the shell than the original inhabitants. So yeah, any questions?
I do have questions. I think that it's a bigger conversation. I'll save to the end though.
Okay, all right, great. So now we're to the sharing part. That's a wrap for our introduction to intertidal invertebrates. We have a few minutes left, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that we can see each other's pages.